Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. This week, I interviewed Henry Copeland, an early pioneer in internet advertising and a leading voice in augmented reality. Long before Facebook started generating billions of dollars on self-service native ads, Copeland had invented a self-service native advertising platform for blogs. And he was building early content management systems for newspapers well before products like WordPress would go on to power much of the internet. These days, Copeland is focused on augmented reality, and he thinks that today's AR products are the equivalent of the blog advertising widgets he was developing in the early 2000s. In other words, we haven't even hit the tipping point that will make AR ubiquitous, woven into the fabric of our daily lives. What will that world look like? And what technologies still need to be invented before we can reach that point? I asked Copeland about these topics, and given his previous track record of spotting trends that would go on to sprout multi-billion-dollar industries, I think we should listen to what he has to say. Let's jump right into it. Hey, Henry, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, Simon.
So, the reason that I brought you on is because you've basically been this kind of early pioneer in these technologies that would go on eventually to become ubiquitous. So like the first thing you did is you basically kind of created one of the web's earliest, what we consider now, I don't think you called it that at the time, but content management systems, right? Like you were a newspaper journalist, magazine journalist, and basically you realized that rather than every single newspaper website, that as each newspaper went online, it shouldn't have to build a newspaper website from scratch, that there should be kind of like this platform that can be scaled across newspapers, right?
Yep, exactly. That was back in '98. I had been living in Hungary as a journalist and moved to France and saw all these little local papers that could be online, should be online, but were never going to have the wherewithal to do it themselves. And so it said, build a kind of an apartment building and rent out floors to them. That was the vision. And today we know that as a CMS and as SaaS, software as a service, rent software rather than buy it and build it yourself.
Yeah. And so like you think of WordPress today, now I think it houses something like a third of all websites, and how everything from the Washington Post to the Vox Media Network, they have their own CMSs that they're scaling out and selling to other platforms. This is like a multi-billion-dollar business. Back then, it was almost hardly anything. Software as a service didn't even exist as a thing yet, and yet you basically saw the writing on the wall of what websites would need, or what these newspapers and publications would need. And so you kind of invented a product around that.
Yep. Well, and we were lucky, bandwidth was getting cheaper and servers were getting cheaper and hosting was becoming, basically the internet was setting itself up to make all this stuff a lot cheaper. And we figured that was a wave that we could ride. And so that worked out nicely.
And then another series of things that you really kind of one of the early pioneers for was one, blog advertising. So you had all this kind of burgeoning blogosphere, but there was no way to monetize it. And so you invented this product called Blog Ads, which was kind of like this universal widget that there was like this HTML code that these bloggers could basically embed into their websites. And it was basically this like scalable blog network that helped turn everyone from, Andrew Sullivan to Josh Marshall to Glenn Greenwald to Perez Hilton into these household names, and basically you were one of the early drivers of monetization of content on the web.
Yep. The idea is, we had a few ideas which in retrospect, again, became bigger than we knew at the time. The idea that you could have do-it-yourself advertising. You could go on a website and buy ads on that website or other websites. The idea that the ads would look like content, which isn't to say you were trying to fool anybody. It was just saying the ads had to be interesting in and of themselves and not just try to shock people, shock and awe. To get people's attention, you'd actually want to have something that was engaging and interesting and get people to lean in and click on it. And then most importantly, the idea that social media, these bloggers had these really passionate, authentic voices that were connecting with readers in a way that traditional media could not. And so we kind of took all those things, put them in a package together, and had a nice little ride.
And again, like that was back then the blogosphere seemed big, but it was really only a few thousand blogs, eventually maybe reached like upwards of 1 million. But now you think of like the kind of the brethren of that is like Facebook and Twitter, that now, Facebook now has over 2 billion users. So it's like, it's about like pioneering and pushing forward these technologies way before they've hit that growth curve of basically near ubiquity. And so we've had those two different cycles. You're now in kind of your third cycle of company, of an industry that you were really into once again, before there was even really a widespread name for it. It's now called AR, augmented reality. And we're seeing some of the first like major products being released under it. Everything from Pokemon Go to Magic Leap finally just released its product. But you were on the scene very early through a product called Racery. What's kind of the 300 feet kind of overview of what that was?
Absolutely. Racery, very, very briefly, it's a simple game. Most of us have participated either in work or school in what's called a step challenge, which is, I walk 1,000 steps today. You take a simple pedometer. I walk 1,000 steps, 10,000 steps. You add it to an Excel spreadsheet, and you're competing day by day by day over the course of a month with your colleagues. We, again, leveraging cheap web resources. A colleague of mine named Bruno Socek had a brother in Sweden and said, gee, I'd love to be able to race my brother. And so we took people's mileage that they would submit, and they could submit by email or by an app. We'd take that mileage and put it onto a map. And so each day, the miles you would create, I would create, would advance our little avatars on that map. And, thanks to, again, Google Maps is wonderful. Google Street Views are astonishing. And you could provide a very rich experience for people of creating this kind of month-long arc of a race that would be very motivational, because people, I run today alone and I run tomorrow alone, I'm not very motivated. But if I know that you're going to see my mileage, and if I know that you're going to be running and you might be sneaking ahead of me, it motivates me to get out of bed and to go and do this stuff. So, you've created this virtual community that is kind of a mingling. And that's the big thing for me right now, is how much of our lives is, how much of the borderline between the physical atomic reality that we experience and then the digital reality, how much those are blurred. And we're living in the borderline between those two worlds right now. And Racery sits right at that, nexus between the atomic and the digital, and turns those real miles into virtual miles, and that translates back into real motivation.
So just to kind of recap, so like, whereas today, like I'm a runner myself. I've done like a 10-miler. I'm about to do a half marathon in a month or two. Most races throughout history, you've been in a physical location with the other people you're competing with. You run alongside them, you race alongside them. What your app does is it creates kind of like a virtual map, so that I can be running and racing against someone who's in London, and our miles are counting towards this kind of virtual map. Let's say it's like somewhere in New York, and you can actually visualize the map, see it on Google Street View, see exactly where it is you and the people you're racing against are on that map. You can also put in like objects, like different, as you pass certain thresholds or something like that, you get different rewards and stuff like that. So basically you can create these virtual augmented reality races that runners across the world, so that they're no longer tied to physical location when they're competing against each other for these races.
Exactly. So not only space shifting, i.e. you can run from anywhere, but also time shifting. It doesn't matter when you run, right? You and I don't both have to show up at Joe's coffee shop at 9 a.m. in the morning to have our experience together. You and I, we run our stuff whenever it pops into the map, and it creates this whole additional layer on top of our everyday experience. So, you and I may be racing around Paris doing a virtual marathon. We may be doing 70 miles in the Grand Canyon. That may be another race we want to do. Or it could be a race that's customized to specific needs. Let's say a company has a bunch of different branch offices. You're hitting one branch and then the other branch. Or let's say your company wants to take the entire company to the moon and run around the moon together. That's possible also. Again, in that case, it would be kind of a company shuttle bus that would be advancing on the lunar landscape. It's fascinating also because one of the things we've discovered is they're very different psychologies, different runners. There's some people who say, I'm not competitive, but you put them on a team of 5 people. And again, in a way that they would never be able to compete. Currently, they're able to all their miles kind of roll up together and advance that team. Other people just very much want to be competing alone, completing that Paris marathon or doing multiple loops around Paris. But time shifting, space shifting. It's worth noting that there's stuff like Strava out there. Do you know Strava?
Yeah, it's like a running app that maps where you're going, what your average speed is, and how many miles you've run.
Exactly. The fascinating thing is they're shifting on one dimension, which is to say you're running the same hill. Let's say there's a half-mile hill in our town, and you and I are not running it at the same time. We're running it on different days, but you happen to run the thing in 7 minutes, and I run it in 6:30 today. And so they build a bunch of leaderboards for all these specific physical locations. And so it's what's called King of the Mountain, who has run that hill or cycled. They got started in cycling. So again, that's another virtual layer, and there are whole communities of cyclists and runners for whom King of the Mountain is absolutely a huge part of their lives. How are they doing versus all these other the macho, killer runners, killer cyclists are competing in this reality that you and I don't see. You and I look at it and we see a hill. They see something where, Joe Smith 18 months ago did that hill in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. My God, I can't believe it. That guy's got legs of steel, right?
So yours is kind of like a mashup of like a Strava and a Pokemon Go, where like what you're doing in the real world actually matters, but it's also imprinting on top of this like virtual world.
Exactly. And, all of this stuff, as we know as human beings, everything's actually just taking place in your brain, right? I mean, the physical reality we think we're seeing and experiencing is really just pulling inside our brain and being processed, and we have images of each other. And so it just turns out that you can create a whole new reality in somebody's brain with a bunch of software cues, emails saying, hey, someone just passed you, or the icon moving, or the leaderboard. All this stuff becomes very real to people once they accept that other people are playing the game with them. It's just like, it gets in people's heads would be the bottom line.
And so you were very early to this, like this app launched like a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah, no, we got it up and running 4 years ago. It's fascinating because there are some folks who just get it and love it. Our biggest race is 3,500. We're going to do another race for that same group in coming weeks, and I think they're probably going to get 5,000 this year. We've got other races that are just 10 or 20 people who happen to know each other and want to run around, a special race course in Arizona that they designed because that's somehow meaningful to who they are. We're also getting ready to play with creating an Alexa version that actually will kind of abstract. What's most important about Racery is not the map, but is the leaderboard. People just like to have a status. They like to know they're ahead of somebody and behind somebody. They like to know that they are seeing and being seen. And so we're going to abstract that and pull a lot of the cues that we've got in Racery over into an Alexa only, or probably an Alexa layer, and then maybe eventually an Alexa only race where you'll say, Alexa, tell Racer I ran 3 miles. And Alexa will spit back and say, you're now number 14 in the race. You just passed Simon. This is day 8 of your streak, for instance.
So just as like when you were inventing or where you were building one of the early CMSs, like most people on the internet couldn't fathom a world where we have like sites like BuzzFeed today that get hundreds of millions of page views. And just as when you were like pioneering early, blog advertising and native advertising and self-service advertising, nobody could fathom that like that blogosphere would turn into social media sites that now have 2 billion users. Do you think that that's analogous to where we are with AR right now? That you're building this platform, and we're seeing some kind of like second generation platforms, like Magic Leap and Pokemon Go and stuff like that. That like it's similarly just like we're just in this kind of very low conversion stage, so in terms of conversion and pickup from actual adoption from actual consumers. This is not even touching upon the ubiquity that we're going to see in a period of years of
Yeah, no, I think that's 100%. I mean, when we got started with, or when I started thinking about the first CMS that we built, which was again software as a service, was what we were imagining back, and I, in 95, 96. I thought, gee, the web has been around 4 years now. I'm sure this has been built. Well, it hadn't been built. And if you think about it, when Google came along with the search engine in 98, and we started hearing about it in 99 and 2000, there were hundreds of search engines then. And we thought to ourselves, gee, why do we need another search engine? What are these guys doing? So I would suggest that we're in the same exact kind of, this is like the web 1.0 circa 1995 to 2000, which is we're getting the first faint inklings of what's ahead in terms of people living these kind of very rich, full, multidimensional digital lives that do not involve typing. They do not involve, even video. They involve interacting in virtual environments with, characters, with figures, with competitions, with games that are very, very real to these people that are totally invisible to everybody else. And I think Pokemon Go was the first inkling of that, when you had people just wandering around town, and there were other folks who couldn't see it and couldn't understand it. Like, what the hell are these people doing? Why are they enjoying this? Well, a lot of us look at NFL football the same way. What do people do with their Sunday afternoons? They watch other grown men, or they watch grown men run around on the field and try to crush each other. That's an incredible amount. I mean, think about that. That's just people kind of projecting their egos out into some absurd universe. The beauty of AR and VR is people are actually not projecting their egos. They are there, they're doing it. And I think this summer was a really wake-up call for everybody. All of my friends from age 30 to age 60 who have kids or grandkids, this summer was the summer of like, what the hell is Fortnite, right? Yeah. Literally, Fortnite swallowed the minds of 8 to 14-year-old young men. And there's another thing called PUBG, similar, very, very rich, incredibly entrancing game. For those of your listeners, everybody knows Fortnite. Very briefly, 100 people land on an island and run around and slowly eliminate each other, and in a fun and interesting way, bizarrely and perversely. And it is, people, it becomes a big part of people's lives, right? And I think that what you're seeing now is the Fortnite generation 10 years from now, 20 years from now, are going to be very used to living their entire lives in this kind of netherworld that's going to be realer than the New York Times world that we live in, right? So if you project that group forward 40 years and you start to, or 50 years, and put them in retirement communities, right? These people are going to be living very, very happy lives, running around doing something. They may not be shooting each other. Who knows? But, the poor advertisers, I mean, the fascinating thing for me is, having dealt with advertisers now for a long time, the poor advertisers who think that advertising is about buying, A, print ad, or B, a static banner on the New York Times. And not picking on the New York Times, I love it, but we're going to be, the amount of attention and care and money and effort that has to go into creating advertising that competes in this multi-dimensional giant new universe is just astronomical. I don't think anybody can imagine how much money they're going to have to spend to market in this world.
And to kind of back up, I really like that analogy you said about Google and how the search engine space was so freaking crowded, and you never thought like, why would you get into search engines now? And then Google like completely went on to dominate it, and then everybody mocked Facebook as just like a MySpace clone, which was an Orchid clone, the Friendster clone or whatever. Like, does that mean that like the Google and Facebook of AR may not even be on the scene yet right now?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I mean, weirdly enough, and I'm not saying Fortnite is it, but Fortnite is a little company. We've known people from there for a long time. It's 10 miles down the road from us in Cary, North Carolina, right? They are, reportedly making, 100, 200, $300 million a month from, people just buying new costumes to wear when they're running around in this world. They're not even buying new tools or weapons that have more power, right? It's people spending money so that they can look extra deluxe in this universe. And again, we laughed 5 years ago, 10 years ago when Second Life came along and people would spend money on, how they looked in this virtual world or the size of houses they had in this virtual world. Um, so, and again, I'm not saying it's Fortnite. I'm saying, yeah, we cannot imagine what tomorrow's big players are. And that's why you see players like Zuckerberg, invest in Oculus. He can see, the dude's thinking the 50-year plan. The 50-year plan is the virtual world's a lot bigger than the world he dominates right now. He better be playing in it. And I think, so you're going to see them spend a lot of money. Google's done always a terrible job of adopting and buying anything that's social. They just don't seem to get it. So it's probably going to be a Zuckerberg, or it's probably going to be somebody else who really gets the social DNA of this new stuff, creating games, creating engaging environments, and who knows? Maybe it is a Fortnite.
So Fortnite, I wouldn't consider AR. Are you kind of arguing that VR and AR there might not be that much of a distinction between the two, and they kind of are, because like it seems like VR was the next thing for like a hot minute, and then like almost as it was kind of like a flash in the pan. And then everybody was like, no, AR is where the real future is. But like so, and I can see why Fortnite is somewhat VR in the sense that it's throwing you into this kind of virtual world and stuff like that. I don't know. Where do you see these distinctions?
Well, no. I mean, your point is a good one. I shouldn't be using all this stuff interchangeably. I am, to the degree that uh, people are inhabiting this world, right? And so I think the line again between the atomic inhabitation and the pixel digital inhabitation is a very thin one. And so if you're in Fortnite, it feels very real to you. I mean, in the same, in as real as anything you experience, when you walk down the street, right? So, yes, that is just in a sense a classic game. But, when you marry that up with an Oculus headset, or any of the other headsets. I mean, one of the rules we know that we've seen is Moore's Law, which basically says everything gets 99, one way of looking at it is every 18 months, the power of a chip doubles. But it also seems like a lot of other stuff will trend along with Moore's Law. And it basically ends up, if you look at the power of compounding over the course of 10 years, everything gets 99% cheaper. So if today an Oculus Rift headset is $400, I think that's the current, that headset 10 years from now would cost you $4, right? So imagine a world in which literally we're surrounded by these headsets, and anywhere, any place you go, you either have one with you or can put one on, and they're as cheap as ubiquitous as, cans of LaCroix soda water right now, right? So again, returning to the old idea that, the guys who are busy creating, long form, let's shoot a 20, it used to be 20 minutes of video is long, and now 3 minutes of video is long, or 15 seconds of blip is long, you know, it's just massive amounts of content that are going to be floating, content slash experience slash games slash just the blurring of line between the physical reality and the virtual reality.
It strikes me that this is going to be require a huge amount of data, and I've been doing some work for Intel around 5G, and about how that, like in terms of you think of like Internet of Things, which AR kind of dovetails into, and things like self-driving cars and stuff. You need to be able to have a ton of information going over the networks at a very fast speed, so there's no latency, no kind of lag and stuff like that. So I'm guessing that, so I'm thinking about, like, in order for us to hit the equivalent of Web 2.0, so like you think of like early blogs, early content management systems being kind of part of Web 1.0, early stages of Web 2.0, and then you had that kind of Cambrian explosion. What needs to happen in order for there to be a Cambrian explosion, that kind of you shift to ubiquity for AR. One thing that strikes me is that we need much faster and much more reliable data, right? That like in terms of whether it's going to your phone or some kind of headset or something like that, since it's in order to build these very rich worlds, that's got to be taking up tons and tons of data. And the other thing is the hardware. So the few successes with AR that I can think of have all been around the phone, which is the current ubiquitous piece of technology. So you have things like running and biking apps, which is the category you're in. You have Snapchat, with its various filters and little like bunny faces and stuff you can like overprint. So that's the other successful AR. And then you have Pokemon Go, and those are kind of like the three most successful versions of AR right now. But they're limited to this phone. I mean, so what are some of the things that, like, when you think of the the switch from a few handful of thousands of blogs to 2 billion users on Facebook, what are the kind of necessities that still need to be invented in order to reach that stage with AR?
I have faith in the process. Let's put it that way. Which is just to say, I'm going to go back to, the power of just about everything doubles every 18 months. Again, just a cheap extrapolation from Moore's law. And so, yeah, it means your phone's going to be twice as powerful in 18 months. It means if or when Apple announces its eye glasses, if or when Google comes back and takes another bite out of their attempt at glasses, there's going to be something in wearables. There's going to be something in voice. You're right. The phone is the most likely kind of conduit or vessel for it. It's
for right now, but it seems like there might need to be another hardware generation of something new invented, whether it, like, you think about either, like you said, Google Glass, or Magic Leap just came out with its headset,
right.
Like maybe that's the next thing that needs, and both are very glitchy at this point. I was just reading this review of the Magic Leap headset. Like, it's definitely revolutionary technology, but it's very glitchy technology. So do you think it's like perfecting something like that takes us to the next level?
I actually think so. The analogy I would make, it would be, I don't think it's the technology per se, the hardware per se, or the software per se. I would say that the revolutions become really powerful, and maybe this is just the blog lover in me, when people are empowered to do stuff, right? And so, WordPress has thrived because it's enabled a whole bunch of people to publish. The guy who built Second Life has built a company, and I'm trying to think of what the name of the company is. What's the successor to Linden Labs? He left Linden Labs, and I'm just Googling here. There are a whole bunch of players. So they've created a platform called Sansar, which, they argue democratizes VR as a creative medium. And so that's what takes this out of the hands of the monoliths and takes it out from the kind of NASA style moonshot projects where someone's got to marshal $10 million in corporate resources and shepherd it along and fight the internal battles and, in a Disney style, then launch their huge project 5 years from now. That allows kind of mom and pop players, or college roommates to say, let's create a little game that does X and see what we can do with it, right? In the same way, think about how Instagram came along, or think about how Twitter came along. You could create a really big, essentially mode without giant corporate resources right now. And that's one of the problems right now with where we are in this whole revolution, is you've got to have huge resources. It's only the biggest players that are creating this stuff and getting enough leverage and getting, as with a Pokemon Go, 10 million people involved in the first 60 days, right? So I think just for the heck of being controversial, I'll say it's not devices, it's not bandwidth. It is actually a mode that allows people to get creative, do weird stuff, build niche products, as Facebook was. I mean, if you think about it, Facebook was created as a product that was supposed to serve a dorm at Harvard College. It ended up that it did a really good job of it, right? And gradually moved outward from there. So I think your next, the true face of the new VR generation will be something that's created by a couple of kids in a dorm and using tools that have allowed them to have some of the powers that the big publishers, the big players currently have. And, when you see that 12 or 18 months from now, you see something that's gotten 1 million users that was incubated in a dorm at NC State, then you'll say, okay, that's the beginning of the new thing.
And, the internet is famously caught the media incumbents completely flat-footed. Do you think that's going to happen again? You're seeing the hinting that Facebook, the current incumbents, which are Facebook and Google as being the two biggest ones, Amazon also, which obviously just invented a new market category in voice. Do you think that they're going to be caught flat-footed in the same way that the previous incumbents were?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be the guy who says, Facebook is going to get its ass kicked or Zuckerberg's going to get his ass kicked. They clearly are behemoths that are going to be hard to beat. And so certainly not in the next 10, 20 years, but I would argue that there will be some very big players who do some very innovative things without needing all of their bucks and all of their firepower. So let's not say Google's going to get caught flat-footed or Facebook gets caught flat-footed, but let's say that a particular brand of tennis shoe is going to get caught flat-footed, and no pun intended. But if you think about
all the other industries that AR is going to touch, not just the internet industry.
Exactly, and right now all of those folks are sitting there thinking, how do I take a traditional shop and put it into a virtual world, right? Yeah, and that's exactly the way incumbents think, which is, how do I take what I've got right now and extrapolate it and make it digital, right? Yeah. Those guys, when it comes to people creating tennis shoes in this virtual world and then having them printed, that's going to be maybe where a Nike gets caught flat-footed. Or, let's create a vehicle and modulate it and, generate this stuff from the ground up and then print it. And then Detroit's going to be like, wow, where did that come from? And somebody's going to make a fortune just making modular motors that then pop into these cars that other people will have printed based on designs that they've made, that first this car became super popular in a virtual world because it just looked, the speed racer car, right? Who doesn't want one of those? And then somebody says, oh, well, we can print that and create that. Or, to take another angle on this, in the same way that fan fiction has become giant, right? And that's all kind of a parasitic. It's a tertiary effect of primary content that's created by these behemoths, the Disneys, the United Artists, all of those folks create this content, and then the world extrapolates on it. Let's try to imagine a world in which fan fiction itself becomes the source of interesting movies or interesting products.
Well, that's a fascinating way of looking at it. Well, Henry, those were all the questions I had. Where can people find you?
SimonRacery.com is the best place. You can also look for Racery app on Instagram and see a bunch of just rave reviews that we get from people who race with us. So yeah, we would love if you're either an advertiser or a company looking to host a race for your staff or customers. We'd love to talk to you.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
Yep. Thank you, Simon. See you.
Okay. That's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.